Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we are going to go ahead and get started. This is Radhika Singh from the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. I think we've given folks enough time to join, and we will be recording the session, so not to worry if you join us late. So welcome again to today's important webinar on combating the opioid epidemic and how civil legal aid can help those who are affected by the crisis. Although NLADA is hosting the webinar, we do have other folks here who are as important, if not more important, to the presentations today and the guidance that we can give to the field. And I'll be highlighting our speakers in just a moment. Before I do that, I do want to go over some logistics for folks. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, we will be recording the webinar, and we will have that recording available for all of you on our website shortly after today's presentation over the next few days. We do have materials for the webinar that you should have been able to access when you logged into WebEx and download. Those also are available on our website for download and viewing, and I encourage you to go and check it out, and it does include the PowerPoint that we'll be using today. The other part of logistics that I wanted to point out is the Q&A box that you all should have on your panel. Please use that to type in your questions throughout the presentations. We will have a portion for Q&A at the end. We find it's helps our webinar go more smoothly if we do presentations first and then have a Q&A period, but we definitely will have time to have Q&A and discussion. So throughout the presentations, type your questions in the box so that when we're at that time period, we're ready to go. That's all for logistics for today. The other thing is, if you do have any logistical questions, type those in the box too, and we will help you troubleshoot audio or visual throughout the presentation as well. So again, just wanted to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Just to speak briefly about what we'll be doing today. You know, the opioid crisis, as all of you know, is still growing in this country, and there are many hands on deck to try to combat the crisis, to try to address it across the country, and we all know that civil legal aid plays an important role in that, what you all do. And so what we're going to be talking about today is really what is it that civil legal aid does that combats the opioid crisis, and also, importantly, how to get resources to do more of that and to do it in a targeted and impactful way. Our speakers today are Elizabeth Weiner from the Legal Aid of West Virginia, Karen Lash from the Justice and Government Project, Stephanie Harris from Ohio State Legal Services Association, and me from NLADA, although, again, my piece will be brief. I will let everyone else really talk about who they are and what they do as they start their presentation. So again, quickly, how we've portioned out today's presentations is a little bit about the populations that legal aid serves and the services that are provided that can help address the crisis, support and resources, so how to make the case and secure funding to support the work that you all do, and models from the field that have recently been funded by federal money to address a certain population in the opioid crisis, and I know that's really the portion that's very useful to all of you. So just quickly to talk about how civil legal aid helps, you know, I think that we thought one of the ways to point this out is that there are different groups of people and constituencies that legal aid serves that are impacted by the opioid crisis. So we know the crisis affects millions of people. There are people who themselves have a substance use disorder. And then to kind of expand beyond that, there are people who are touched by people who have a substance use disorder. So family members, traditional family members, parents and children, and also, you know, close friends the community around that family that's touched because that person has a substance use disorder. And then, of course, there are communities. And this is, really what happens to communities when there are people whose lives are destabilized, there are people who are not working, there are people who are homeless. That has an economic and a social impact as well. And so when we talk about, individuals and we talk about families, we also, I think, should be thinking creatively about communities and what legal aid does to shore up the stability in communities. So with regard to how many of these people are affected, these are just some quick numbers that can kind of help put the crisis in context, which is that when we think that expanded group of people, so we have numbers that say that more than 2 million people have a substance use disorder with regard to opioids, and then when you expand that to families and close friends or close people who are connected to them, that's more than 11 million people in this country, and I think it's still growing. And then the communities, you can see here what the economic burden is estimated to be on communities. And again, there's a number there that is with regard to just health care. So immediately people who are going in and need health care, how much that is. And that's, not even talking about the collateral impact in terms of communities. So some of the things that legal aid does to think creatively about and broadly about what you do that helps people who are affected is that we can look at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has some guidance here that says that when people are managing life in recovery, they look at these 4 categories, which is health, home, purpose, and community. And people need to feel or have access to health services, of course, and be able to get healthy. They have to have a stable home life, which includes family members and someone to rely upon. They have to have a purpose, to feel like they have a meaning in society and a community around them. And so when you think about the things that legal aid does, not just with regard to people who have a substance use disorder, but of course, when you can target it in that way, to actually establish and shore up these 4 areas, right? You secure people's safety. You get them housed. You pull them out of situations where they continually are trafficked or facing violence. All of the work that you do to help people get safe from these areas, and then you stabilize people's income, right? You get people access to benefits and housing assistance. You remove barriers to employment. And with regard to substance use disorders, including obviously mitigating any criminal records that may be related to that, but also with this really important piece of medication-assisted treatment, that actually is a barrier and can be a barrier because of the stigma it brings to many things. And the ability of legal aid to actually advocate in court or advocate with housing providers or employers about how important it is for people to stay on their MAT is a big deal and very unique to the legal context and healthcare context. And then in terms of families and communities, you can see here, and you'll hear more, I think, about from the specific projects that are going to be discussed, about all the things that legal aid can do in the family context. And then again, with regard to communities, everything that you do to stabilize people is going to help reduce the cost to communities and mitigate the cost to communities. And so the last piece that I just wanted to point out was that this can look many different ways. So oftentimes when we talk about services that legal aid provides to help with the opioid crisis, we go to medical legal partnerships because it makes sense and it actually has a very large impact, a very significant impact when there's a partnership with a healthcare provider to help people enter and remain in recovery. And again, referring back to all of those things, home, family, community, purpose. But then there are other types of partnerships that can help as well. So it's not limited to medical legal partnerships, and I think we should think broadly about different types of collaboration, partnerships with courts. So for example, the top 2 referrals for people to enter treatment are the healthcare system and the courts. So being in the courts and having a partnership with the courts is very important in terms of, again, helping people enter and remain in recovery. And then, of course, the family law portions and helping children, a lot of those issues are going to manifest in the court setting as well. And I have here two, you can see 2 links under medical legal partnership. There's a really great brief that the National Center for Medical Legal Partnership has published. And then with regard to courts, the National Center for State Courts and the Conference of Chief Justices has a National Judicial Opioid Task Force because they know how important courts are in addressing this crisis and want to work with legal aid partners to do so. And then the third type of model, which we'll hear more about, I think, from our featured presenters, are collaborations with community partners. So that's just kind of the quick overview that we wanted to provide to everybody to kind of get you thinking broadly, to talk about the fact that, you know, just because you haven't had a practice focused on serving opioid, people who are impacted by the opioid crisis does not mean that you're not doing the work already. So I will now pass it over to Karen to talk about how to support, how to find support for the critical work you're doing.
Thanks, Radhika. That was a great overview of the many ways that legal aid is an essential partner to an effective response to the opioid epidemic. So my task is to give a super fast overview of possible funding sources, hardly exhaustive, but what I hope is a good intro. And before I get started, I should warn that my PowerPoint violates every rule of good PowerPoint presentations by having way too much information on them, so don't even try to read them. The point, I mean those texty slides, the point is that it should be viewed as a handout. My goal was to put enough information about each of the different funding sources with hyperlinks so that you can do a deeper dive on those that seem most relevant to what you do. Next slide. I want to start with an oversimplified primer on federal block grants, grants that go to the states to administer. So the life of a block grant starts in Congress. Congress passes a law and it establishes these particular block grants that will go by formula to the states. They establish the purpose of the block grant and how it should be used and appropriate funds, and they name the federal executive branch agency to administer those funds. So then within the statutory authorization, that agency will further elaborate, consistent with the law, the rules and guidance for states to actually spend the funds. So there's some useful common denominators for almost all federal block grants, and that is, those include that the funds go by some set formula relevant to the purpose of the grant to all the states, territories, and D.C. States generally have a lot of discretion to set their local priorities, consistent, of course, with the rules and guidance. Most of the funds will end up with local sub-grantees, including legal aid providers and sometimes courts and other social service providers. And it's useful to know the state's award is not competitive. In other words, they will submit periodically a state plan for how they're going to spend the funds. They fill out the application annually. They submit their reports. And as long as they don't violate the rules, they're going to get their state's share. Last point is that the governor in each state will typically pick a state agency or department to administer the block grant, and that varies state by state where each block grant will live. It's sort of a Where's Waldo game. Some of the slides have links to make it easy to find out where your state administers a particular block grant, but generally it's just a Google search away. And the governor will choose an executive branch decision maker or department that has expertise in the particular block grant area. So next slide. Most legal aid programs provide some of their services thanks to some of the several dozen federal block or formula grants that expressly allow states to fund legal services, or they have broad language, like states can provide supportive services that are relevant to the purpose of the grant. So the four listed here are relevant to the opioid crisis and have some express language about legal services or a history of supporting legal help even without that language, or as of yet are untapped, but the language is broad, allowing states to identify the specific services that they'll fund, so an opportunity to make your case. Next slide. So because these funds are administered by the executive branch, it's good to know what your executive is saying about the opioid crisis. It's generally easy to find the direction that your governor has given to his or her agencies on the opioid crisis. Everybody is talking about it. These are just a few examples of governors making policy statements about the crisis really being an all hands on deck. So an opening to make the case for the need for civil legal help. Next slide. So now that you know what your state leadership says, you also need to show how providing legal aid is an evidence-based practice. Because virtually all the block grant applications say that the state should be using evidence-based practices when spending their block grant funds. So on this slide and the next one, I just copy and paste from the opioid fact sheet that we prepared. That's the citation. The URL is on the slide. And it's really just to coax you to, next slide, to just go to the fact sheet. There are citations to all of these studies that together, help. They show both the problem that the opioid crisis is creating, but also how civil legal aid helps address the problem. And both for the children of parents with substance use disorders, as well as the people with the substance use disorder themselves, and the benefits that can come from having civil legal help. So if any of you have identified or used any other studies or data, we're interested in collecting them, so please send them to me and Radhika. Okay, on the next slide. So now you've got the backdrop that state administers these federal funds that allow them, if they choose, to use them for legal help to address the opioid crisis. So this is the first of the four that I picked. At the federal level, it's administered by the Health and Human Services Substance Abuse Prevention and Mental Health Services Administration. As Radhika said, it's way easier to just refer to it as SAMHSA. And they administer a substance abuse block grant that every state gets. Importantly, the SAMHSA solicitation that states respond to expressly promotes partnerships in addressing substance use disorders, and specifically names medical legal partnerships as an example, which is very helpful in making the case to a state administrator that the funder, the federal funder, SAMHSA, has noted the role that legal help plays in making a difference for people with substance use disorder. Next slide. So this is the second block grant that's most relevant for responding to the opioid crisis, aptly named State Opioid Response Grants, and it's also administered by SAMHSA. This texty paragraph is the opening paragraph in the solicitation. The solicitation has no express legal services language, but legal services should easily fit into that reference to services that provide prevention and recovery activities. The total that's going out to the states is close to $1 billion, divided up by formula, but there is some extra set aside for the 10 states that are hardest hit by the crisis. The specific allocations to each state are in the solicitation itself, and that's the URL for it. On the next slide is just more helpful language from the same solicitation, recognizing that people will need a comprehensive array of services, great language, and they don't provide an exhaustive list of what those services should be. Note 2, the reference to the state's strategic plan. I mentioned this in the 90-second block grants overview. It's important to review that document about each of the particular block grants to see, so you can really help make the case for how legal aid fits in to what your state has already told SAMHSA it's going to do with those funds. On the next slide is the third block grant. This AmeriCorps funding has a real history of supporting legal aid and courts in self-help programs. This year's AmeriCorps solicitation lists 7 priorities, including reducing and or preventing opioid abuse. On the next slide are resources to really help you understand how AmeriCorps works and a link to where to find your state commission. I acknowledge that AmeriCorps is a difficult to administer program, and you really will generally need to find some other private or public funds to run a good program. But that guide, written when I was still at the Justice Department, describes how it all works and the experiences of a number of state courts and legal aid programs that really swear by their AmeriCorps members and their AmeriCorps programs and are really strong supporters. So let's see, on the next slide is the last of the block grants that we'll talk about. The Victims of Crime Act, more commonly referred to as VOCA, allocates a significant portion of funds from the congressionally created Crime Victims Fund to provide, its whole purpose is to provide, or the VOCA, Victim Assistance Formula Grant Program's purpose is to provide direct services to help crime victims. The Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime administers the VOCA funds, and important to note is that in 2016 they published a federal rule that updated and all of the rules around how VOCA administrators can spend those funds. And important for our purposes is that they greatly expanded the forms of legal assistance that VOCA funds can support. It also laid out 3 areas that states must prioritize and set aside funds to address, and one of those 3 areas is child abuse. They also made the definition of child abuse more flexible. And key, especially in the opioid context, about that definition and about the VOCA rule generally, is that it does not require law enforcement intervention regarding the parent or caregiver for a child to qualify, so that for the child to qualify as a crime victim. So on the next slide is some helpful information for figuring out VOCA funding in your state. And a key reason for diving into this one is that you'll see starting in 2015, there was a dramatic increase in the funding that every state has received, and an even bigger bump in fiscal year 2018. States have 3 years plus the year they received the funds to spend them. So most states are still planning and prioritizing use of those 2018 funds, and probably still have some of their 2017, maybe even some of their 2016 funds. So it presents a real opportunity. On the next slide, information about how you find out more information about what your state is specifically doing with its VOCA funds, and also some helpful data about crime victims in your state. Okay, on the next slide, yeah, that one. We're now done with block grants. But here's a sampling of some federal grants where social service providers would apply directly to the federal agency for the funding, instead of in the other, with the block grants, where you're focused on state administrators. So I focused on 3 that are or look promising based on the language and their awards history. The first is this another SAMHSA administered grant called the Offender Reentry Program. That's a link to the solicitation. The last fiscal year, the application was due in January 2018, so we're hoping it'll come back again, and but you can click through to read the solicitation and see if it might be a match for your work. Again, it's really broad language about providing recovery and reentry services, which legal services should surely fit within. The second one on this slide is currently open. This one is administered by another part of Health and Human Services called the Health Resources Services Administration, better known as HRSA. They will be making up to 120 awards of $200,000, and it's a planning grant. So for recipients of a planning grant, there's the prospect of additional funds being available for implementation. Again, the focus here is on rural counties, but it also has very broad supportive services and prevention language. Okay, next slide. Whoops. Okay, so I saved the best for last. Last summer, 4 legal aid programs in Oklahoma, Kentucky, and on today's panel, West Virginia and Ohio, applied for this grant, the Enhancing Community Responses to the Opioid Crisis, Serving Our Youngest Crime Victims. This solicitation did not name legal services specifically, but again, the services language was really nice and broad. All 4 of those legal aid programs that applied received the grant. So 3 final points before we hear from them. First is that 4 of 41 grant awards went to legal aid. that strikes me as a powerful and useful statement. The DOJ recognizes that legal aid is an important service to offer in response to the opioid crisis. Summaries of all 4 of the grants are on that opioid fact sheet to hopefully help you make that point. Second, any of those 4 programs funded directly by this DOJ grant are also potentially, the program that they're funding are also potentially fundable with the VOCA formula fund and consistent with the VOCA rules. So similar partnerships and programs are potentially pitchable to your state VOCA administrators. That's what I covered in slides 12 through 14. Third is the DOJ post-grants they intend to offer during the fiscal year, and depending on Congress passing a budget, this one does show up and is expected to be offered again in the first quarter of 2019. So whether you're considering applying for this grant directly, assuming there's a budget and it's offered, or you want to propose something similar to your state VOCA administrator, we hope you'll be inspired by these pioneering programs. And I think Stephanie is first up.
Please. Hello? Just to give you a little bit of information about Ohio State Legal Services Association, we are a very extensive, a very large organization. As our mission here states, we're committed to searching out the patterns, causes of, and solutions to the repetitive, fundamental legal problems facing low-income Ohioans and pursuing the legal recourse needed to address those problems. The next slide, please. We are made up of actually 3 organizations. The Legal Aid Society of Columbus, which serves 6 counties in southeastern Ohio, or in central Ohio that you see there in green. And SOL, Southeastern Ohio Legal Services, which serves 30 counties and has offices in Athens, Chillicothe, New Philadelphia, Newark, Portsmouth, and Steubenville, and the Ohio Poverty Law Center, which is not funded by LSC and provides statewide legislative policy analysis and advocacy. So the next slide, please. We got to, as Karen mentioned, we did apply for the Department of Justice OVC grant, and we were awarded the maximum amount, which is $750,000. And we got there through a variety of different sources, meaning that we have begun to think about how we should, as an organization, respond to the opioid crisis in our communities. Just to give you a little bit of background, 1 in 14 of all opioid overdose deaths and 1 in 9 of all heroin-related deaths in the United States occurred in Ohio in 2017. So this is a huge problem in our state. I mean, the book by Sam Quinones, Dreamland, documents the beginnings of the opioid crisis in Ohio, in central Ohio and in southeastern Ohio, in one of our communities, Portsmouth, Ohio, in our southeastern Ohio service area. So this problem has really been something we've been thinking about for a while. In conversation, really several years ago, I had a conversation with Karen Lash about ways that we could tap into federal funding. And from that conversation, it really made me start thinking about how we could leverage the partnerships that we have developed, how we could create new partnerships to tap into federal funding, even when that federal funding did not specifically indicate that legal aid organizations were an eligible applicant. So here are two of those examples. We now partner with Alvis Workforce Development in our urban area, that's Central Ohio, in the Career Pathways Project. That's through the Department of Labor. That's an adult reentry project, and we have now been a subcontractor for 2 grant cycles in the amount of $175,000, and we're moving into the 3rd grant cycle. Juvenile Reentry Assistance Program through the Department of Justice and HUD. That's a partnership with our local public housing authority, Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. And the goal here is to provide youth who live in public housing and who have had some involvement with the criminal justice system with civil legal assistance to help them overcome barriers to employment, barriers to training, barriers to education. And for us, we received $100,000 for that project. Next slide, please. We also operate several medical legal partnerships in urban and rural communities. So the first partnership actually this is in reverse order in a way, but we'll start with the first one here, the one in orange, Ohio Better Birth Outcomes. And this is a partnership with all of the adult hospitals in our urban area. So that would be Ohio State University Medical Center, the Cardinal Health Hospitals, which are called Ohio Health, and the Catholic Hospital System, Mount Carmel Hospitals. And through this partnership, which those hospitals fund, we have 2 attorneys who work on site in the hospitals to provide assistance to at-risk pregnant moms and their infants. The goal here is to have some effect on infant mortality in our communities, which is extremely high, especially in our African American communities. The second one there in gray, the Medical Legal Partnership with the Counseling Center, is a direct response to the opioid crisis in our southeastern Ohio area. This is a partnership with a very large, very well-funded behavioral health center in Portsmouth, Ohio. And the focus here is improving the percentages of positive outcomes for individuals with substance use disorder participating in outpatient treatment. In other words, we're helping them to do some of those things that Karen and Radhika mentioned. We're helping them to stabilize their lives, helping to prevent homelessness, helping to connect them to resources, financial resources in the terms of public benefits and others. And we're also helping their families, so we are intervening with school situations when their kids are being expelled or suspended from school, and we're trying to help reduce those stressors on their lives that would possibly impact anyway, their ability to stay in treatment. The next one, the one in yellow, is Nationwide Children's Hospital. Nationwide is one of the largest children's hospitals in the country. And this one actually was our first medical legal partnership in our urban area. And the focus here is improving the physical and behavioral health outcomes of children by addressing health-harming living conditions. That project has grown. We are now in our 4th year. It is also totally funded by Nationwide Children's Hospital. And it was actually through a recommendation from the General Counsel of Nationwide Children's Hospital that we began the Ohio Better Birth Outcomes Medical Legal Partnership. So the General Counsel for Nationwide Children's started talking to General Counsel at the adult hospitals. They met with us, liked what they were hearing, and we began that medical legal partnership with a pilot project which has grown over the last 3 years. The next slide, please. We've also partnered with ADAMH Boards. In our communities, that is Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Boards. And those boards are indeed how the state funnels some of that SAMHSA money that Karen mentioned and that Radhika mentioned. So our Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Boards actually have the funds that go out to providers in our communities to provide direct services to folks who are either recovering from drug addiction, who are suffering with mental illness, or having other kinds of behavioral issues. We have developed partnerships that look very similar to medical legal partnerships with the ADAMH boards in our Franklin County urban area and in our rural area. And through those ADAMH boards, we are funded to provide services, direct services to their clients, to the clients of the various providers. So now we are part of the line item budgets for both of those ADAMH boards in our service areas. Our next slide, please. Services to victims of crime in rural communities. So we have been receiving VOCA funding especially in our rural area for about 15 years. And in our urban area, we've received VOCA funding for 5-6 years now. And in this funding that you see here, the $330,000, that is funding for our rural program, VOCA and VOWA programs. And it is through those various pots of money and through those various partnerships and thinking strategically about how we could provide additional services to people in our communities who we knew were struggling with the opioid crisis, with substance abuse disorders, how we would address issues that we knew children were struggling with, children and youth in our communities. We, keep pretty close tabs on what's happening in terms of health in our community, and health in many different ways in the broad sense of that word. So, for example, in Ohio's child welfare system, there has been a 19% increase in the number of children removed from parental care since 2010. And now the Child Protection Services has close to 14,000 children in custody in Ohio. And many of those kids will be in custody until they age out of custody. In Ohio, that would be 18. So we've got kids who are going into custody at a much earlier age, who are staying in custody much longer because their primary caregivers are suffering from substance abuse disorders. So we have seen certainly the increase in the number of kids in protective custody, the increase in the number of kids in kinship care, and as we began to think through that and again try to expand our thinking about how we could provide services to this population of children and youth, we thought that this opportunity, the DOJ OVC grant opportunity, presented an excellent focus for us to take advantage of the partnerships we've developed, the length of time that we've been in our communities. We've been providing services in central Ohio since 1954 and in southeastern Ohio since 1976. And because of the nature, particularly of our rural communities and the offices that we have located there, our offices in those communities operate as their own offices, meaning that the geographic nature of southeastern Ohio means that our offices are very far from each other. So each of those offices has a special place in their community. Most of the attorneys who work in our rural offices live in the communities where they work. So they have developed relationships with community partners, with local government, with the courts, with the bar associations in their communities, and we thought that we could bring those entities together in this project. Again, once we began thinking about this, I had some extensive conversations with Karen and with Radhika about the idea. One of the other attractive things about this was that the definition of victims of crime, what DOJ, OVC, how they defined child victims of crime was very broad. So that gave us even more encouragement to go after this funding, because then we could look at children who were in kinship care, kids who were in foster care, kids who were victims of abuse, young people who had witnessed drug overdoses, young people who had been victims of bullying as a result of the opioid crisis. and other ways that children are victimized as a direct result of the opiate crisis. And it gave us an opportunity also to think about the different entities within our communities that were providing services to children, and how we, as a catalyst and convener, could bring those entities together, develop some common language around the services that are being provided, what services need to be provided, how to provide those services effectively, and provide space for parents and kids to talk about the services that they're receiving and the services that they need. And that's exactly, basically, what this project is designed to do. So we, meaning Southeastern Ohio Legal Services, is the catalyst for this project, is the facilitator and the convener. We are working in 17 of our 30 counties in Southeastern Ohio, and we have another legal aid partner, which is Cincinnati Legal Aid, and because they have 3 counties in Appalachian, Ohio, in Southeastern Ohio. So we will work with them, with our local university, which is Ohio University, to develop evaluation methodology for this project, and with a group of core leaders that are made up of Children's Protective Services, the courts, law enforcement, the schools, and others in our community. We will begin to have discussions about what services are being provided to children right now, what services need to be provided, how the gaps are, how to fill those gaps most effectively and efficiently, and then how to evaluate that and how to communicate what we're doing to the community across the board, meaning to all 17 counties. So this is an exciting opportunity, and it also dovetails with some other projects that we're in the process of developing right now. Certainly the Bank of America funding that we received a little more than $1 million in Southeastern Ohio, another million or a little more in our urban program, and we're using that money in Southeastern Ohio in particular to focus on community revitalization. And so that certainly dovetails with this project. We also have additional money, $300,000 or so, to provide services to kids in schools in our Southeastern Ohio service area. Again, the school systems are completely overwhelmed. They are providing services to kids that they have never provided before as a direct result of the opioid crisis. And we know that many kids are being pushed out of school. Kids with disabilities, kids who are minorities are being pushed out of school, suspended, expelled, sometimes as a result of the opioid crisis, because of behavioral issues that the children are having in school. And if we can intervene and help those kids get the services they need to stay in school and be successful, that is all part of the process of community development and community revitalization as we see it. So that whole process then has attracted the participation of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and they have decided that they will provide us with a community organizer. They are interested in this project because they have never really participated in community revitalization in rural communities, always in urban communities, New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., etc. But this will be their first opportunity to really invest in community revitalization in a rural community. So we are just tremendously excited about that opportunity and how then it will work across the board with the initiatives that we see coming together to improve workforce development in our communities, access to quality education, access and availability of affordable housing, services to children who are victims of crime as a result of the opioid crisis, and other ways that we see that are necessary to necessary parts of revitalization in our rural area to include transportation, which is a tremendous need in our rural communities. There is no public transportation right now. Even the issue of e-connectivity, broadband is having access to computers, having access to reliable cell phone service in our rural communities is really a problem. And so all of those coming together with the investment that the National Community Reinvestment Coalition is making is really a tremendous opportunity for us, and we're just tremendously excited about it. And I think now, I believe that's my last slide. Here's some resources. That's right. So I just wanted to provide a few of the resources that we looked at when we were putting together the DOJ OVC project. And I'm providing them because I think most people have similar resources in their communities. So certainly through the Ohio Attorney General's office, there was a joint study committee on drug use prevention education in February 2017. The Public Children's Services Association of Ohio prepared a brief and white paper about the opiate epidemic and its effect on children. Certainly the Children's Defense Fund, the Ohio Department of Health, which, in most states there is something similar, and because the opiate crisis is nationwide, most health departments have some really interesting and reliable data. The U.S. Department of Justice, part of this grant from the Department of Justice, talked about trauma-informed services to children, evidence-based services for children, and this Vision 21 Transforming Victim Services really spoke to that in ways that helped us learn more about the topic and really helped inform our thinking about what we wanted to say in our proposal. And then another piece here, evidence-based practice in real-world services for young people. Again, it was one of those pieces of information, one of our pieces of research that helped us to learn more about legal opportunities and how legal aid could be of benefit to children in this particular context, and how evidence-based practices could really make a difference in the lives of young people. So I thank you very much, and I think we are now going to hear from Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wayner from Legal Aid of West Virginia. I'm going to talk to you about our Lawyer in the School project serving opioid-impacted families. I'll start with just a very little bit of context. I am the managing attorney at Legal Aid of West Virginia for Grants and Training. I have been with our program first as an attorney and now as an attorney/program manager for 20 years. I am well on my way to being a legal aid lifer. And Legal Aid of West Virginia is a statewide program that covers all of West Virginia's 55 mostly rural counties out of 12 local offices. We have a staff of about 140, about 50 of whom are lawyers. Next slide. And as most of you undoubtedly know, Appalachia as a whole and West Virginia in particular are at the absolute epicenter of the opioid epidemic. So we were tremendously excited about the fact that we did receive some funding that enabled us to launch a new program, the Lawyer in the School Crime Victims Project. And I'm going to give you just a very short overview of the project. In the slide, our funding for this initiative comes from enhancing community responses to the opioid crisis serving our youngest crime victims, which is a discretionary grant, one of the ones that Karen mentioned in her presentation that were awarded by the DOJ Office for Victims of Crime this past summer. Our goal for the project is to stabilize kinship caregiver families with civil legal support. The model that we are utilizing is a school-based holistic legal services program with pro bono support. It is actually based on a successful pilot project that did not have an opioid focus when it was designed, but as we discovered, it was absolutely opioid focused when we began the implementation. The services that we are providing within this project are civil legal help for kinship families who are navigating permanency options, the whole gamut, we call it, from the note on the napkin to full-blown adoption. The public benefits that those families are often unaware that they can access, housing, employment, access to child care, and a whole gamut of other legal issues that impact those families. Next slide, please. As with any initiative that we undertake at our program, we try to start with a really rock-solid grounding as to the why. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, the opioid-impacted piece of this Why an Opioid-Impacted Kinship Families project was overwhelmingly clear to us at the point that we applied for this grant. The imperative of the epidemic, others in Appalachia and in the Midwest and other parts of the country that are really impacted by the opioid crisis are aware. This touches every single one of our program's local offices. It touches our own families, our schools, our communities. I think of it as the defining issue for legal services in Appalachia for my time. Within our staff, we just had our statewide training and all saw each other in person, but we have staff who are in recovery. We have staff who have lost family members, including adult children. We have many staff who are caring for children of family members. The most recent that I learned about was one of our attorneys in his late 20s, went from being single guy to being dad to 3 kids under the age of 5. He's now raising his sister's children. So it hits all of us. And we were very much aware of that when we went out to do our needs assessment in 2016. We did a series of community meetings held statewide with thought leaders on poverty that included clients, community agencies, all kinds of folks, and identified the opioid epidemic at the absolute center of our clients' issues and concerns and their legal needs. It is also then something that we took our needs assessment and built our most recent strategic plan in which we prioritize civil legal work to positively impact our clients impacted by the crisis. Next slide. Next slide. So the less intuitive part of this is why an opioid-impacted kinship families project. For us, it really grew out of some things that we were already doing at the point that we made the grant application. We had existing partnerships where we were just seeing these cases over and over, these kinship family cases, these relatives who had a whole range of legal issues they were struggling with. We were seeing them. We have a long-standing partnership, 15 years plus, with our State Department of Health and Human Resources to serve TANF recipient clients. And even as the grants manager, I was stunned in preparing for a meeting with DHHR last year when I pulled the statistics on the amount of our caseload that was child only, 71%. And when we went and met with the staff at DHHR and talked about that project that we assist those TANF families, the staff at the higher echelons of DHHR told us that they believe that 71% figure was due mainly to the opioid crisis. DHHR, for funding our partnership, actually increased our dollars last year despite all kinds of budget woes in our state, and it was because we worked with them to talk about reorienting our partnership to better serve those kinship families. And so they increased our budget enabled us to give raises to that staff on a parity with the staff in the rest of the program, and also allowed us to hire a coordinator position for that project and an additional attorney. So we were really excited about that. Another partnership that this focus on kinship families grew out of, we had a group called the West Virginia Healthy Grand Families Project that was started with a grant to a university in West Virginia, and their social work department runs Healthy Grand Families. They approached us and asked us to do legal training and to provide legal assistance to their participants. So we were doing that without any special funding, but we're learning more and more about the legal issues that these families are facing. Finally, we had this lawyer in the school pilot project that we developed in 2016, and for those who are LSC grantees might be interested to know that this was actually created as a pro bono innovation fund grant. But come to find out, when we got into providing the services in this very challenged school, we learned that we were mainly serving kinship families, and it was the whole gamut of the issues that that I mentioned earlier that these families were facing: the permanency, the benefits, questions about education law, people who've never dealt with an IEP, and other education law issues, housing, etc. So those things are existing, long-standing partnerships. We were seeing these cases. Our new partners were approaching us, and we were seeing this even in this successful pilot project we were doing that was designed to attract pro bono attorneys, but was really working with this client population and seeing that they had tremendous needs. Next slide. So how would you go about launching this kind of a project? One of the things that, it is probably the case for the programs out there listening on the line that you, like Legal Aid of West Virginia, are already serving these clients and these families. But the other thing that we have learned as we have gotten more into this work is that it is really useful to work with them in a more targeted way, and certainly identifying targeted resources for these families and the opioid impacted kinship families in our service area has enabled us to develop better resources and a much higher level understanding of the needs of this group. Plus, like other legal services programs, we are doing so many other things for so many other vulnerable groups in West Virginia, and we're the safety net for so many, that having the targeted funds has really enabled us to expand the services without pulling away from some of the other things that we were involved in. So how do you get that money to do a special project? I think Karen, I cannot say enough about her and her expertise and her assistance with identifying federal funds and strategizing with programs about how they can tap into those funds. And so I would definitely make her and her willingness to consult with all of us your first port of call when you are trying to strategize around what federal money might be appropriate and how best to craft and frame your proposal. The staff at NLADA, they are certainly experts as well. And then I also put a link to a federal funding. It's a massive compendium, and I have just begun to sort of go through it myself, but it's a new USDA listing of all the various federal resources designed to enable rural communities to help address the substance use disorder crisis. So I commend that to you as well. state funds. Look at funds that are the block grant funds that are coming down through your Department of Health and Human Resources. Look at Department of Education funds if you can tap into them for school-based projects. Foundation funds. Some foundations are unwilling to fund civil legal services to those who are in recovery and are substance use disorder, people who are suffering from substance use disorder, but they will fund the kinship work for relatives raising kids. West Virginia being the small state it is, last weekend I ran into a major foundation funder, Appalachian Foundation funder at our local Lowe's, and I chatted with her about her board and their resistance to funding projects for those in recovery, but she did share that her board loves the idea of helping the kinship families. And she acknowledged, kind of off the record to me, that the stigma around the opioid crisis is something that she has plans to educate and to tackle with her board, but she was also, kind of cluing me in that realistically this was what they were open to at this time. Next slide. Launching a project, identifying referral partners and a project site. Through the Pro Bono Innovation Lawyer in the School project and through some of our other work, we learned that, and actually we have served now on the board of the Grand Families Group as well, and through all of those experiences, we have learned that connecting with kinship clients is harder than you would maybe think it would be. They can be hard to connect with and to make them aware of the services. There are cultural and generational factors at work. Like a lot of potential legal services clients, they do not frame the issues and problems they're dealing with as legal issues. They don't see them as something you would involve a lawyer in. It's just a hassle that you can't get the food stamps that include the child, or it's a hassle that you can't get the child registered for school, or it's a hassle that, there's no formal custody arrangement and the child is going back and forth between your house and the other grandparent's house, and that, there are difficulties around that. So having the issues actually framed out as legal issues, having the project be in the school is a way to get past that lack of identification that a lawyer could be helpful. The school-based projects work well because staff make referrals and there can be the option to have drop-ins. Through our grant with, we're a sub-grantee with Marshall University as well as receiving our own grant. We're going to get referrals from some counseling organizations as well that are school-based. But the school is a good locus for being a place where you have the teachers and the counselors and the staff generally referring families to the project. We learned with the Pro Bono Innovation Grant that law firms really enjoy working with these clinics that we hold at the schools, and that adds a pro bono element to the project. I guess the important thing in doing a school-based project is clearly that the school district and the individual school buy-in is really critical. And I will say, in terms of the school-based project, there's a resource that Radica will be putting on the NLADA website, and it is a guide to launching a school-based legal clinic, Lawyer in the School project. You could use this whether or not you were applying for opioid funds, but if you do use that particular angle, then the same principles would be applicable in terms of actually setting up the project. So that's something that people can check out after the presentation. Next slide. And some data, I know Stephanie mentioned several places to find data for the project. Couple additional sources: State Protective Services data, State Child Protective Services, state level statistics on the number of kids in foster care, and I was able to find estimates as to how many were due to substance use disorder. Kids Count is a great source of data that's often broken out down to the county level. The CDC maintains data around neonatal abstinence syndrome, and I was able again to find county level data from that source. And then finally, the United States Census has data by state and county on the number of grandparents responsible for kids living with them. And you kind of have to drill down into their website to find it, but it is there. Next slide. And then finally, this is just a little bit of the actual dollars and cents of our project. It kind of gives you the costs for the 2 grants in which Legal Aid of West Virginia was involved with the DOJ OVC. And most of our money went into attorney salary and benefits. It's a very people-intensive, focused project. And so that gives you a little bit of the breakdown for that. As Stephanie referenced as well, there is a strong requirement in the DOJ OVC opioid grant to have a coordination element. So they really they want to have a coordinator who is a project coordinator who is also pulling together community resources, community partners, community players, and holding regular meetings. That's going to be a part of your grant, whether you're doing the kind of project that Stephanie's team is engaged in, or whether you're doing a much more individual client services oriented project like ours. So just be aware that that's going to be part of the picture. Partnerships are critical. And finally, what's next for us? We do not have a medical legal partnership, and so we are going to be pursuing that. We're going to look at some of the funds administered by our DHHR from SAMHSA and from other sources to support a partnership with a treatment provider that will focus on disability discrimination against clients in recovery using MAT. So I think that brings me to the end on the final slide. And do feel free to reach out to myself or to the lawyer and the school attorney, who is wonderful, Melissa Lilly, or to Adrienne Worthy, our executive director. Kate White was actually the architect of the original Pro Bono Innovation Grant, but she is currently on maternity leave. So at least for the next couple months, the team that's listed on this slide are the ones that you would contact at Legal Aid to learn more about this project.
We are going to open it up to the questions now, but with one brief note about this news story about Legal Aid Society of Cincinnati and a partnership with the courts and a pro bono program that in 90 seconds wonderfully captures a lot of what you just heard in an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes. About the importance of providing legal services, at least on the kinship care side of the opioid crisis. So now we're on to the questions.
We are on to questions, and so we did have a few questions come in, and I'll remind everyone to, there's still opportunity. Please continue to post your questions in the chat or Q&A box. And we'll pull them out and pose them to our panelists. I will ask Elizabeth and Stephanie to come off mute, please, so that you may respond to some of these questions. And I think we have a mix of questions. We have some very specific questions about funding and some more broader about some of the work being done. So let's start on the broad end with this question, which is, how do you go about identifying actually when a client or a family is affected by opioid use disorder or substance use disorder? So is there something in your screening or intake questions that can reveal this? Or is it kind of a more targeted search for clients?
This is Stephanie. I'll go from, we have, I guess, a couple of different ways. One of them, because we do have a medical legal partnership with a behavioral counseling center, which is called the Counseling Center in Portsmouth, Ohio. Actually, we, in our preliminary discussions with them, we talked about how generally we could identify people in the general service area, not just people who were being treated at the counseling center, but what their suggestions were to us for identifying people. And so we have put into place some screening protocol when people are referred to us, when they call us, when they walk in. There are some questions that we have begun to ask, and also through some of our other work in our medical legal partnerships in our other communities, we are beginning to do the same thing. In many cases, because of the education work we are now doing in the schools the schools are just really, traditionally they have seen us sometimes as an adversary, but more they're seeing us as a partner, and so we're having lots of conversations with them about the families in their community, and they are referring those families to us, and so we are learning about how we can effectively identify people in our communities through our partnerships with other service providers.
This is Elizabeth, and with regards to our school-based project, the original school-based project that we then added the overlay of targeted services to opioid-impacted families did not have a requirement that be the target population. So for the new project, we did build in some time that is not VOCA funded for each of the staff members so that they can do some work if the school refers a child who or a family that does not have opioid issues but just really needs legal help. The goal with those families is going to be to pass them along to another legal aid staff member or a pro bono attorney, and the attorney who is VOCA funded will keep the cases for direct rep and longer term rep for those families that do have the opioid issues. We're going to ask the school counselors. We're going to have to do extensive training for the school counselors and do some training for the teachers to refer families where they are aware of an opioid issue. And then we're also going to be, as part of this coordination community role, doing convening some meetings and doing some cross-training for other referral partners, including law enforcement, county prosecution staff, Handle with Care, victim services, children's counselors, after-school programs, CPS, Child Advocacy Center, Healthy Grand Families, and others. And so they'll have the opportunity to refer kids who are from families with opioid issues, as well as taking the cases that are generated by the school where we're doing the clinic. I should say clinics, because we'll be in a handful of schools.
Okay, great. Thank you both. There actually is a follow-up question to that one question that we received, and then we have some more specific around how to pursue funding. So this question, I think, is for you, Stephanie, which is, during the screening process, do you know what questions are actually being asked to identify folks? And if not, or we can post materials as well if you don't know them right offhand.
Oh, I see. You're asking specifically what the questions are. I don't know right offhand. I'm so sorry. But one of the things that we did to get this started actually was to do a survey of clients at the counseling center. So we surveyed maybe 200 clients at the counseling center, and we wanted to know what their legal problems were, and we found that of all the respondents, that 200 were the number of people who responded, that each of those 200 people had more than 4 civil legal problems. And so from that survey, we began to work with our counseling center and with others. That was kind of the catalyst to help us define what the questions are. And I'll be glad to share that information. I can send it to Radhika, and Radhika, if you would, share it with others, that would be great. But I'll be glad to share that screening instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll post it on the same webpage that we'll post the recording on as well. I think people will find that very useful to have a sample intake or screening questions. So let's move to some of the funding processes or questions about your specific projects. One is, there are two that are related, I think. One is, how challenging has it been to actually establish a nexus where it seems that the issue, might not be so obviously related to substance use disorder? So, for example, if there's an education, an educational need that there's a legal solution to, how do you establish that nexus? And then related to, I think, or maybe at the same time you all can think about and try to answer, what types of outcomes are required by funders? So, for example, is it enough to show the service provided, or are you actually following up and showing some positive outcome? And to stay in the educational context, how far down the line do you have to go? So if you've established and you've gotten an IEP put in place, is that enough, or do you show a positive benefit from the IEP?
Okay, well, I'll go again. So here, let's just jump right in. So I think let me take this in several parts. With our education work, if I'm understanding this correctly, how do we establish the nexus between the education work that we're doing and the opioid crisis? Is that the question? I think.
Yeah, I was a little confused as well.
Okay. Well, here's how I think through our communication with the schools, and we've had extensive communication with the schools, and actually our education work began before we applied for the DOJ OVC grant, and that helped to inform our decision to apply, because the schools were telling us we have so many kids who are having so many problems as a direct result of the opioid crisis. At least in the school system, that's how they were interpreting it. And we think for the most part the schools are in tune with their population of kids. They, especially in our rural communities where the teachers live in the same community, the communities are relatively small, there's not a lot of movement in and out. So they are pretty familiar with their classroom populations, with their school populations, and what those families are experiencing. So they were able to give us some real history about families. They've had family members from the same family go through the school system, and also oftentimes through the same teacher for a couple of generations. So they have been able to give us some of that history of the family. They've been able to document the kind of services, let's say, they provided to kids in 2012 or 2010 compared to what they're being asked to provide now, and it's changed dramatically. Many of the schools are now creating food pantries and clothing pantries because kids are coming to school without those necessities. And relate this directly to the opioid crisis. So from that standpoint, they helped us to see what they were seeing. So they provided that education for us. In some of our other examples in our medical legal partnerships, for example, in our urban community with Children's Hospital, certainly the docs and the social workers there are seeing kids who are coming into the hospital and whose parents or whose caregivers often are presenting with substance abuse disorders, and they can see that many times. You know, they recognize that when children are brought into them, and they have seen the effect on children coming into the clinics, especially into the ambulatory care clinics where we have an office. So it is really through that combination with our partners that we've learned more and more about this. In terms of how we document, certainly we want to see positive results, and we want to document positive results when we get a kid an IEP or when we get them services. Then certainly we want to try to follow up and see what exactly is happening. And one of the reasons that we want to do that, one, we're concerned about the success of the kid and the family, but also because it helps us then to talk to the next round of funders or to the next group of funders or to that next foundation about the success that we're having with what may have seemed like a pilot project. It is now, and it has become a part of our service provision. So and then we are becoming more and more aligned with the universities in our communities who are tremendous resources to help us develop evaluation methodology. Medical legal partnerships, the hospitals, the health centers, they are really concerned with cost benefit. So, we know what we are good at, and sometimes we're not as good at developing that evaluation methodology as others in our community. So we have begun to partner with Ohio State University, for example, OU's Voinovich School of Government, to help us develop and think through those evaluation strategies to help us document what we're doing right, what can be improved, and so
on. I think that in terms of our creating the nexus or showing the ways in which our project is impactful with regards to these opioid impacted kids, we started out of this pro bono innovation grant, and within that framework, some of the metrics for success were different. It was pro bono engagement, and it was extremely successful on that front. But then as we have gotten some sustainability funding for that particular project and have seen it begin to carry on, we've also seen for these opioid impacted kids in that school some just real positives that we're now beginning to start the next phase of developing better evaluative tools. We do know that the absenteeism is down in the school as a whole, and we are hoping that the types of interventions we're doing on behalf of these families are going to be also contributing to better grades for the kids. There's a great story in the digital guide that's going to be on the NLADA website about a little girl, the one who was shuttling between the two sets of grandparents and going to two different schools, who went from low grades to all A's once she was stabilized and able to just be at one school. So we're working with the school districts involved to work through the data collection that we will need to do around, some of the privacy issues and being able to get waivers to be able to check and see whether there is an impact on the grades for the impacted group of kids, whether their school attendance is improving, and some of the other things that that funders like to be aware are happening in anything that's supposed to be driving positive outcomes for elementary age kids. The other piece of it that will be clear from our case data will be we can go into our case reporting system and pull out any financial gains for the family that contribute to their stability as a result of the legal work. We already record that for every client where we achieve any kind of a financial gain anyways. And any financial avoidances we'll be able to track in CAMPS. And through case outcomes data from our case reporting system, we'll be able to track how many of these families were able to establish permanency of some kind, and that is attractive to the schools, the state, and the funders, because you are preventing these kids from going into foster care if a family kinship placement is not sustainable.
Okay, thank you both. So we are close to time here. We're pretty much out of time. I will point these questions to each of you because they're very specific about your projects, and then I think we'll do a wrap up. And just to remind everyone, I know we didn't get to all of the questions. We do have the speaker's contact information here if you have some more specific questions about the project. And again, all these materials, including the recording, will be on our website. Quickly, Elizabeth, for you, with regard to your referral network is the first part, which is a very poignant question, which is just, are aging services providers included in your network? And then with regard to the pro bono tasks, you mentioned, your project started out as a pro bono innovation fund grant. Which tasks did you find were the most successful? For example, was there a tendency to have the advice or brief service clinics more populous, or was it, some other type of representation?
We do work with aging services providers. We work with, we've done presentations for those groups. I think that, honestly, in terms of the number of referrals that we can sort of document that we've gotten with the kinship families, they have been more likely to come from the Grand Families group or the school, and I'm not discounting the aging services groups making referrals to us. I think that does happen, but I think, being someplace on site where you can meet people where they're at is really powerful, and so that's been really effective. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to go with a school-based clinic rather than a more sort of agency-to-agency referral model. And as far as the site-based clinic, thus far, and this is why we definitely wanted to have legal aid staff who were kind of on-site, staffing these clinics, serving as the ongoing kind of coordination person for the clients that are coming into the clinics. The families come into the clinic, and the pro bono lawyers are on site. They've had some training to do interventions around benefits, housing, family law, as a brief service and advice. And then a handful of them have been willing to take longer representation, full direct representation. The majority of them have been more comfortable with coming to the clinic and just doing the brief advice. But the next wave of the established lawyer in the school is going to be to give those folks some additional training and to encourage them to take longer-term representation cases. But we're well aware that some number of them are never going to really feel like that fits their situation, and we're just delighted that they're willing to come to the school and give their time there. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. And so, Stephanie, your question is about partnerships. With regard to the partnerships early on in terms of forming them, did those come from local staff office contacts, local office contacts, or were those kind of managed and pursued out of the central office?
No, those were actually, well, when we began talking about, if we're talking about the DOJ grant now, when we began strategizing about this project, one of the things that immediately came to mind was the really strong partnerships that the local offices have developed. Not the central office, but the local offices out in the rural communities. I think, as I may have mentioned before, most of the staff in those offices actually live in the communities and have lived there for a number of years in the communities that they're serving, and they have developed these very strong relationships with the courts, with the schools, with kinship care organizations, with protective services, with the offices of job and family services in their counties, and with other resources. And it is one of the things that was most attractive and that helped us to really think so positively, or that was so encouraging about this opportunity, was that we knew we had those partnerships and that we felt confident that we could bring we could be that convener, that facilitator to bring the conversation together.
Great, thank you. So again, we are kind of out of time, but we have your questions if you type them in, and again, you have our contact information. Sorry we did not get to everything. We do have some additional resources again. We've typed into the box that we have a page set up on our website, on NLADA's website, that houses all the materials. We'll post the recording there and any additional materials that our speakers send in. We've referenced a few things throughout the presentation. You'll find the links here, and again, this PowerPoint is on that website. And then I want to thank all of our speakers again. You have something?
Just passing along an offer from Voices for Civil Justice that any of the programs that are interested in developing, a media story about the connection between civil legal aid and an effective response to the opioid epidemic, they are hungry to talk to you.
Yes, please use Voices. They are the national communications arm for the civil legal aid community, and very important. And then, so again, yes, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to Elizabeth and Stephanie for all the work that you've done in terms of really blazing the pathway for legal aid in this space, and Karen for all the work that you've done to blaze the pathway with federal agencies. Just regarding the funding really quickly, again, we've talked about different types of funding and resources throughout, and there are, there's funding from private foundations, the federal government and states. And in terms of the giant block grants that we've spoken about, that's federal money that's going to state agencies. The states don't have to apply for it in most cases. They get it based on a formula. What legal aid needs to do is get at those tables with those state entities to advocate for how important they are. And there was a question about returning citizens or formerly incarcerated persons, and whether there's targeted funding for that. If you go back kind of to Karen's slide, she highlighted the ex-offender program from SAMHSA. And then just to say, one of the good things about these block grants is that they are tailored to local needs. So if that is a local need that you can show in your community, then you can make the case to that state administering agency that they should be using the funding for that. And again, if you have questions about funding, Karen and I are happy to take those questions. You have our contact information. But thank you again for your time today. Thank you again, Elizabeth and Stephanie and Karen. With that, I will end the recording and sign off. And again, I hope to hear from you all if you have questions or if you want to pursue this funding, which I hope you do. Remember, you're doing the work, and regardless of, there are many causes, I think, for a crisis like this. And it's, as Elizabeth so eloquently pointed out, it's reaching us and touching us in so many ways, and the communities that we serve in so many ways. And so it is really an all hands on deck. And legal aid is one of those critical pieces, one of those critical hands that need to be at the table. Thank you again, everybody.